Oli here, and this is my first ever movie review where I'll be reviewing The Entity. Released in September 1982, it's a horror movie directed by Sidney J. Furie and is based on a book written by Frank De Felito. And the said book and the movie was actually based on true events as was stated in the credits. Basic overall gist of the movie is that it's about a single mother. Her name is Carla Moran. She has three kids, one teenage boy and two young girls. She gets raped and attacked by an invisible entity, which also leaves bite marks and bruises all over her body. And this is something that's a recurring event. At one point, the entity actually attacks Carla in front of her children, and even harms her teenage son Billy, and actually breaks his wrist. So Carla starts attending therapy, and Dr. Snyderman is the one that's treating her. He dismisses this, but dismisses the whole entity theory and believes that Carla is self inflicting the wounds on herself, and he even suggests that this entity could represent a desire over her son Billy, which understandably Carla does not really agree with. A few attacks. Carla's friend Cindy witnesses the entity attack Carla, and Carla and Cindy decide to visit a bookshop where she bumps into two parapsychologists. They agree to study her home. Snyderman comes in and tries to convince Carla that it's all in her mind, but she refuses to listen, and knowing that she does this because she has this relief that the case has actually been taken seriously. So Carla starts calming down until the entity actually decides to rape her in front of her boyfriend Jerry, who's traumatized with the experience and decides to break up with her. The parapsychologist decides to trap the entity by creating a made-up version of her home in some sort of gymnasium and with the use of liquid helium. But Snyderman comes in and believes that this is going to do more harm than good to Carla and tries to get her out of there, but she refuses to leave with him. The entity decides to attack her, but when Carla stands up for herself, the entity gets mad and decides to want to try and kill her instead. Snyderman actually sees this and actually saves Carla in the nick of time, and he actually witnesses the entity for himself, so now he actually knows that this thing is real, and the entity actually gets caught up in the liquid helium and is temporarily trapped in this huge block of ice. So Carla decides to move away from the whole house, and the entity tries to come in once more and says to her, "Welcome home, can't." Carla is not threatened by this and decides to finally move out of her family. The credits actually stated that Carla still received visits and attacks, but the attack became less frequent as time went on. So that is the basic gist of the entity. Too fast on horror movies because today's horror movies are quite rubbish because the directors actually focus more on the jump scares than the actual plot itself, and The Conjuring is an example of this. But in my opinion, I think The Entity is a great movie, despite it has its faults, but it's still better than at least a good chunk of the horror movies that are released today, such as pretty much the whole Conjuring series and the whole franchises that came along with, such as Annabelle and all that. And even well-known director Martin Scorsese has even named The Entity to be one of the all-time scary horror movies, and it's very understandable why he actually thinks that. The production of the movie was really good. I think real-life places were actually used instead of sets as pretty much the basic classic Doctor Who stories where they were filmed inside the BBC television centre with some location filming. The special effects were very good for the early 1980s, especially when the entity was grabbing and sucking on Carla's breast in bed. You can see the grabbing points and how it's really sinking into her, and it was very creepy as well. And it was also very graphic because you can actually see Carla's nipples out, and you can see the whole the entities grabbing her, and you can actually hear trying to suck her and all that. It was very creepy. And I liked the electric discharges that it represented the entity for a bit. It was really cool. The script was very well done, and I must say I really liked the score by Charles Bernstein. It was very simple yet effective and very memorable, such as the whole motif when the entity actually comes and attacks Carla, which is probably most very memorable considering the fact that it was played several times and it did get quite annoying. The direction by Sidney J. Furie was good. He did capture some very good moments, and I liked how he was able to convey some emotions from certain actors. Like example, I liked how he was able to make the entity's attack on Carla look realistic and scary without gratifying or objectifying anything, even though there was full frontal nudity involved, but it didn't really like gratify it. It just made it out as if it was creepy or so scary and all that. And it was very distressing as well because it actually addresses rape as a major theme in it. And there was once one of my favorite scenes in this movie was when the entity tried to attack Carla in Cindy's home, and then Cindy actually saw it, and then Cindy actually told Carla that she saw it, and you can actually see the joy on Carla's face when she said it was very beautifully well. It was very beautifully acted and directed. And even though Sidney J. Furie didn't actually do any research, and he or the lead actress Barbara Hershey didn't meet Doris Blether, whom the movie was actually based on. It was still a very good job. The plot of this film was very good, and as well as the themes that were used, such as Carla trying to convince people, such as Snyderman and the parapsychologist, even though they actually did agree with her at some point, and that she was being attacked, and someone actually said that the entity was a parable for female sexual victimhood, and I can see why, considering the fact that the men didn't really believe her, and then when they actually want to like see if the entity was real, they start like prodding her and treating her as if she's some sort of lab rat. And even Fury said himself that he doesn't really see the entity as a horror movie, even though it actually is considering he actually sees it as some sort of supernatural suspense film, but it is horror because it does have some very horrific themes such as rape and all that, and obviously the atmosphere of this movie was quite scary, and apparently there's supposed to be some sort of incestuous plot between Carla and Billy, and I'm glad that it didn't come to pass, not only because it was weird, it didn't really fit in with the plot at all. I mean, I think I was reading somewhere, I think the actor of Billy even said that there was some sort of scene where he was going to be shirtless outside and Carla was just looking at him. It wouldn't really fit in with the plot. I mean, if you think about it, a single mother gets attacked by an invisible entity, and while she's lusting for a teenage son, doesn't make sense. So on to the acting, I would say it was very well done, and we have the main characters, and they're all very well written. So off, we have Carla Moran, who was played by Barbara Hershey. Hershey was great in this movie, and she really made Carla's character come to life. The scenes where she gets attacked by the entity was very well acted and very well directed by the director and well acted by Hershey herself, and how she conveys her emotions was very good, and I like the scenes, well, how scary it was when the entity decided to attack her in front of her children, and it was a good scene. It was a well acted scene. It was definitely, I would say, that was probably the scariest scene of the whole film, to say the least. We have Ron Silva as Dr. Phil Schneiderman. He's Carla's psychiatrist, and Silva played Schneiderman very well. And I like the scene where Carla was asking him, was she insane? And Schneiderman just responds, it depends on what your actual definition of insane is. And he actually does care for Carla, and even though he doesn't actually believe in the entity himself until towards the end of the movie, but he was looking out for Carla's well-being, and he was very understandably concerned when Carla starts working with the parapsychologist, and he believes that they're pretty much just going along with it, and they're probably going to do more harm than good. And then we have David Labiosa. He plays his Carla's oldest child, Billy Moran. He didn't really have much to do because Labiosa actually injured himself when the entity broke his wrist, and he had to be written out of a few scenes, which is understandable. He was good and he was well written in a way, but I still think it was underdeveloped, but I'll get to more on that in a bit. But I liked how he was protective of his mother, and especially when he actually thought that Jerry was attacking Carla, even though it was the entity itself, and I liked how he was looking after his younger sisters, to say the least. We also have Alex Rocco as Jerry Anderson. He's Carla's boyfriend. He didn't really have much to offer to the plot other than being freaked out when he saw Carla getting raped by the entity, but he was an okay character. We had Margaret Blythe as Cindy Nash. She's Carla's friend, and she is one of the few people that actually knows about Carla's attacks, but she assumed there was men breaking into the house and just raping her until she actually sees the entity attack Carla herself. She's missing after that scene, and then I think she reappears in the ending when the entity is dealt with, but still came back afterwards. But she's still an interesting character. We have Jacqueline Brooks as Dr. Elizabeth Cooley. She is one of the parapsychologists trying to get to the bottom of capturing the entity. She doesn't believe it until she sees the entity herself, and I thought she was an okay character. We have the other parapsychologists, such as Jean Croft, played by Joe Meehan, and Raymond Singer, who plays. Sorry, the parapsychologist, Jean Croft, and Joe Meehan, they were both played by Richard Barazoff and Raymond Singer, respectively. They were decent characters and they were a good duo, and they actually do help stop the entity, which was very impressive as well. And finally, we get Carla's two young children, Kim and Julie Moran, played by Natasha Ryan and Melanie Gaffin. They don't really do anything to the plot other than get frightened by the entity when it comes in, when Carla's freaking out by the entity, and when they actually do see the entity rape Carla. That was a scary scene, and we also have to get some good scenes as well, especially with the whole family just having fun, to say the least. And last but not least, we have the main villain, the entity. The entity was a very scary character due to the fact that we couldn't really see the entity, and we absolutely do nothing about it other than his obsession with Carla and how it will harm anyone that will come between itself and Carla. And will pretty much attack anyone who got in the way, such as Billy, for instance. We only hear the entity speak towards the end when it was saying to Carla, "Welcome home, cunt," at the end, and that was it. And the entity was an interesting character and a good villain because you don't really know much about it, other than the fact that it wants to just fuck Carla for no reason. And I do have some issues with this story. I did feel as if it did drag in some vital scenes, especially in the middle when the entity attacked Carla and in front of her kids, and I do think that, and I think it was a bit long, it runs shortly after that, and I do feel that some of the characters such as Cindy, Billy, and the other children, I think it was Kim and Julie, yes, I felt that they were underdeveloped because the plot actually mainly focused on Carla and Carla's attack by the entity, but I really think that the writer could have at least featured some parts on how they would have explored the psyche of all the other characters I mentioned, like Cindy and the kids. I mean, I would love to have seen Cindy actually interact with her husband shortly after the entity attacked her. Sorry, the entity attacked Carla in front of them, and the husband was like, "She just wrecked the goddamn place," and then Cindy was like, "She didn't. It wasn't her." And I would have liked to have seen a bit of interaction between them, and also I'd have really liked to have seen some bit of interaction with Billy and his sisters, because considering the fact the entity broke his wrist, I'd have at least liked to have seen how they were affected. I probably would have liked to see how he would have tried to like reassure his siblings, saying everything's going to be okay or stuff like that. But this really could have been done to try and make up some of the movie's laggy parts. It doesn't really take away from the whole film, but it's still a very good horror movie, and I definitely recommend it, considering the fact it's one of the more underappreciated horror movies from the 80s, because you have the stuff like The Shining. I think that was the 80s. I'm not sure, but I think The Shining was part of the 80s, but still, it's a very good movie, and I'll give The Entity an 8 out of 10. Thanks for watching this movie review, and let me know what you thought of this movie if you've seen it, and if you'd like to want to watch it, go ahead and watch it, and please subscribe to my channel if you've ever done so already. Until then, see you later.